welcome to Next Round with me, Dale McDermott.
And me, David W. Higgins.
A young Irish look at the economy, politics and society.
Covering home and abroad.
For the thinkers, the dreamers and the doers, this is Next Round. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Next Round. Today we want to talk about a few different items, with the first being around presidential gaffes. Now, President Trump in the US is not the only president to have made a few gaffes over the years, and I'm referencing, of course, the Irish president, Michael D. Higgins. And we're coming off the back of UN General Assembly Week in New York, where world leaders descended on Manhattan for the annual gathering. And with that, President Higgins was there, and it was not without a gaffe or two. So we want to talk about that, the history there, but also in the context of the Irish election for president, which is taking place in the next year. Former Taoiseach Leo Varadkar also has been making comments this week about the prospects for Irish unity, and also believing that it should not just be an ambition for the Irish political establishment, but it needs to be a reality. And I want to talk about that and the context of Northern Ireland, its economy, and what that might look like if there was to be unification into the south. And also some job data has been released about job churn data in Ireland, which has just been released by the CSO. So a jam-packed agenda. And again, if you do like this podcast, please like it, please share it, and please subscribe to it. We're available on all major podcast platforms. We're also available on YouTube, where you can watch us on our YouTube channel. And you can also subscribe to our channel there and like us as well. David, it is great to see you again. I hope you're well.
Doing well, Dale. We're both back in our what we call home. Me in Dublin, you in London.
Yeah, and it's I'm back to a grey, dreary, and flood-filled day here in London, and I think Ireland's been the same this week as well. So, but we'll put that behind us, and we'll focus on a bit more interesting stuff, which is around. First of all, we are, as I mentioned at the start, David, we are coming out of the back of UN General Assembly Week, which is, of course, the annual time of the year where world leaders gather in Manhattan in New York. And representing Team Ireland this week, we had President Michael D. Higgins with the Taoiseach Simon Harris, Taoiseach Micheál Martin, and also Green Party leader, Minister Eamon Ryan, all there representing and putting on the green jersey. But
Dale, do you mind if I say something?
Go for it.
It's people always get this, but Eamon Ryan is no longer leader of the Greens. It's Roger O'Gorman.
Oh my God, that's right. Yeah, sorry. He's but he's still a minister, and he's still
a minister for transport and climate, of course, which is a huge issue that goes to the UN.
Yeah.
But isn't it remarkable that he has such a standing within the Greens that we would kind of think of him as kind of an internal leader?
It's been etched and ingrained into my head that I will get the flow out of it at some point, and we'll move on to Roderick. But one thing, though, that has happened this week has been with respect to a bit of controversy. So I'm referring, of course, to Michael D. Higgins and his controversy around congratulating and sending a diplomatic congratulations to Iran, and the controversy with that, with Israel. But this is, of course, on the back of a history, and a pretty long history of the president making comments which may not be seen presidential or in keeping with the Constitution. So, David, I know this is an area of passion for years. You've been tweeting about it this week. What are your thoughts?
Look, I'm getting really sick of President Higgins, to be honest. And we've had two terms of this. We're into the last year of 14 years that he'll be in office, and throughout that time he consistently oversteps his constitutional role, which is quite a limited role. It's quite a ceremonial role. It is about representing Ireland at home and abroad, but what he does is he ends up putting his foot in it, and actually commenting on topics that are beyond his remit, commenting on day-to-day policy. So I talked this week on Twitter about a hat trick where President Higgins denied there was a link between migration and homelessness. There is. He made comments towards the state should be directly building houses. That's not your role to decide. The most optimal way to build houses probably is with state funding, but may not be the state actually building them. And then the third one, of course, the claim that the Israeli embassy leaked a letter that he sent to the president of Iran welcoming that new president. That's also false. It was leaked by the Iranians themselves, and not a leak. It was posted by the Iranians on their website, on Twitter. That Twitter post was then subsequently taken down, but within that time it was picked up by the Israeli embassy and was widely circulated and promoted. Now, if President Higgins had attacked the embassy for that, which he then did in a second press conference, and just attacked them for promoting it and kind of sharing it around, that's a valid criticism. But he effectively lied on that issue when he was asked, and that to me is a real worsening of the standing, because at least in many of the episodes in the past, it hasn't been a telling of a mistruth. It has been using the presidency for quite, I think, ideological means. So taking you back through some of the stories, I mean, you can go right back to 2013 in the early days of his presidency, where he paid tribute to Hugo Chavez, who was a dictator at the time in Venezuela. And then you can move towards 2016, where he does it as a tribute to Fidel Castro, who is the head of Cuba. And of course, Raul Castro then took over after that. He called Castro, quote, a giant among global leaders. And in both of these cases, he talked about advances in things like literacy, healthcare system, and other achievements that these regimes had. But this is a bit like saying that, when Hitler died, oh, yeah, well, the Nazis were great at building roads. I mean, like,
but Ireland, of course, Ireland has form on this kind of stuff, right? We were one of the few, I think, if only European countries to actually send official state condolences on the death of Hitler, I believe, right?
Yeah, we were, and that still stands
was government. But that was a government decision, I think. It actually wasn't presidential. If I'm
and this is where I think in the wider issue of Ireland's foreign policy, sometimes we're not very good at seeing the bad guy, and particularly amongst a cohort of Irish politics, and it's a real common problem on the left. There's not enough willingness to see that some of these regimes are just toxic. So fast forward to today, Venezuela and Cuba. Cuba's standard of living has not moved much at all. There's still higher rates of immigration of people trying to get out of Cuba. And in Venezuela right now, under Nicolas Maduro, they just rigged an election, blatantly rigged an election, where some of the percentages of the vote share added up to like 110%. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, not only are these guys crooked, like, they're stupidly crooked.
And of course, in Cuba, there's lots of concerns around journalist rights and the jailing of journalists who've been attempting to cover the regime there, and then there's a wider theme around human rights for journalists in these regimes. President Higgins, he has form on this. I mean, he's been a critic of U.S. foreign policy. He's been a critic of the market economy as well, European austerity policies. In 2016. He made a speech which was critical of that, the Israel-Palestinian conflict, of course. He has made a number of comments around that. But also more domestically and at home on, let's say, with respect to the housing situation, as you mentioned, David, he has criticized that, calling it a disaster, which is, of course, very strong language from a president. But all of this is in the context of he's extremely popular. And these, a variety of these comments don't seem to have dented his popularity and his standing amongst the Irish people. If anything, he's more popular now than ever before. And he is, of course, also Ireland's only political millionaire, having received over 1 million votes in the election. So this begs the question, David, the role of president in Ireland, in what is this a case of the president and President Higgins? Is he evolving the role and making it more what it needs to be in an Irish circumstance, or is he pushing the boundaries too much?
Oh, it's a complete waste of political energy, right? So we are unique as a small country in having two houses of parliament. We have the Dáil and the Seanad. A lot of fellow smaller countries in the Nordics, New Zealand, and elsewhere just have one, and their presidency will also be something that's kind of impartial. We effectively have three Joe Duffy style arms of the state. So we have the Dáil, where you can raise issues.
That's not fair on Joe Duffy, David. That's not fair on Joe Duffy, please.
But just look, everyone loves Joe, right? I'm not saying a bad word about Joe, but like that's I think the term to describe what our houses of parliament are. We have topical questions gets raised in the Seanad, but now the president does it too. So we have three arms of the state that are all trying to raise issues. We have an entire complex of state-funded bodies that are also trying to advocate on issues as well. And the presidency, in a way, he's stepping so far outside his role that it actually puts the standing of his role at risk. I mean, I should give the example of, well, what if Peter Casey had won the last presidential election, and we had a presidency who wasn't actually left-leaning but was right-leaning? Well, President Higgins has now set a precedent. That precedent is you're allowed to mouth off on day-to-day policy, raise the issues of day-to-day importance that you think are the ones to address, and the government of the day can't say anything back to you. So what you'll notice from the past 13 years is that the Irish government has done a very good job of actually not getting into a kind of a retaliatory row with the president. What they've done is they've constantly just fobbed off the issue because they know if they end up in confrontation with the presidency that they may end up causing the president to resign. They may end up saying something back that they can't. It's a very difficult situation because the presidency, so like we end up. Yeah.
Well, just the one thing I want to add here is that, you can say on the one hand that they've done a good job in not engaging in the conflict and almost fobbing it off, as you said. Or you could take the point of view that actually they haven't done enough to kind of get this into line. The government has to approve everything that the president says externally by a speech. I believe that's in the Constitution. So is this a case that they're just not approving it? Has there been a breakdown in communication between Áras an Uachtaráin and government buildings on how and when and what the president says? Because surely that's not doing the job.
Well, no, this comes down to cases in large part which are beyond topics that the president would decide that the government would approve. So take, for example, the issue in 2022 of Sabina Higgins writing a letter to the Irish Times talking about a, quote, peace deal in Ukraine, very short number of weeks and months after Russia invaded. And that was very much outside what most Irish people thought at the time, which was that, well, hang on a minute, we're not going to go straight to negotiations here. Ukraine needs to fight back because otherwise Ukraine would just agree to whole chunks of its country being negotiated off in a so-called peace deal. And that was majorly controversial. It was published on the website of Áras an Uachtaráin. I would bet that particular decision that kind of micro management of the Áras doesn't happen by the government.
The spouse of the president is not an office either. There is no reference to it in the Constitution. It is not a formalized piece. So yeah, why was that on the website?
Exactly. Like that was a breakdown in.
We don't have a first lady or an office of the first lady. No. It's not a thing.
No, we don't. And there's like something like formal speech. I would bet that the UN speech that President Higgins delivered, which was the thing that people didn't talk about much. He did give a speech that was probably approved by the government. But the problem was a press conference that he gave where he made that accusation about the Israeli embassy, which he then, like a presidential spokesperson was out the next day to basically say, well, that wasn't what the president was trying to imply, that there was a leak. But he blatantly replied to a question effectively saying, oh, I know how it was circulated. And then later in the sentence, it was the Israeli embassy. Like that was every push notification I got on Sunday was leak. That it was an accusation of a leak. And the president there is in a case where he's outside a formal speech, so he can kind of say what he wants. And he ends up putting his foot in it. And it's just becoming a continual embarrassment for the role of president. I mean, the thing that I have started to think about is, well, what does the next presidency look like? One thing I did was I just looked up what the opinion polls are saying on the potential next president, and maybe I'll just list some of the names that are that are out there on it. So right now, as of yesterday, so that's the 26th of September, you have Neil Martin and Mairead McGuinness are actually front runners at 4-1. So that would be someone from the Fianna Fáil side, someone from the Fine Gael side, and then you have Fergus Finlay at 6-1, and that would be someone from the Labour side. And Labour actually have great form in presidential elections because of the past 5, they've won 3 of them. Mary Robinson, and then the 2
and
President Higgins terms.
And Fine Gael have won 0.
0, yes, yeah. I mean, and then you have other names up there: Miriam O'Callaghan, Emily O'Reilly, Sean Kelly, John Finucane, Michael McDowell, Luke Flanagan, Lynn Rand, Bertie's down there at 16-1, and then it continues, and you end up right the way down at 500-1. Brian O'Driscoll, Roy Keane, Bono, Blind Boy, and Brendan O'Connor.
So, Bod, I think if Bod ran, I think he should be a bit higher than that. I think Bod would actually get a better outing, I think, than Bono, definitely, or Blind Boy.
Yeah, he would.
Yeah, and look, it's now, of course, the one name you skipped over, David, and this speaks to the risk of these type of popular events, is Conor McGregor, who was 20-1. And he's someone who has actively expressed an interest in running for the office. But I think this speaks to the point of which you referenced before about Peter Casey and actually how well he did in terms of getting votes last time as a bit of an outside candidate. Now, of course, it's for listeners who aren't exactly following in detail the process of being nominated for president, it is a pretty hard task to be nominated. You can either go down the route of getting Oireachtas members. I think, is it 20 Oireachtas members, David, that have to nominate you?
Yeah, 20 Oireachtas members or 5 county councils.
Or 5 county councils have to nominate you. And of course, county councils are generally controlled by some of the major parties in block format. So getting a nomination from councils can be quite hard. That said, in 2011, nearly 14 years ago now, when we had our contested process for election, that's when we opened the gates, I think, for independent candidates, where councils took the decision to actually allow names to surface and actually contest the election, which was traditionally before that a bit of a 2-way or 3-way race. So what do you think, David, on kind of the risk to the standing of the office of president? I mean, it used to be over the years above politics, very much ceremonial, as you mentioned from the outset. But do we risk it descending into almost like a social media contest?
I think there's enough checks on the nomination process to limit the numbers going forward. And well, okay, there's some drift in that, right? So, okay, we had 7 last time, and they were of mixed caliber, to be honest, of the candidates who ran last time.
You're being very polite there, David.
Yeah, I am. But what happens in the race when it proper gets going is there is a lot of scrutiny on the individuals.
There really is. Yeah.
It's very deep in people's personal lives. I think of the likes of Senator David Norris, who experienced a lot of controversy over comments he made at a much younger age in his life around pediastry, which is kind of like ancient Greek stuff around male relations. Yeah. Anyway, we won't digress on that one. But that led to a lot of scrutiny, i.e. you end up by the end of it that whoever is the cleanest kind of squeaky clean person does tend to win it.
Yeah,
safest bet. Yeah. So, and that was Michael D. Higgins back in 2011, after many other candidates stumbled. So I think you end up ultimately with probably the sharpest tool does end up going into the Oireas, but it can depend on how sharp the field is, right? Here's something that I'm beginning to think about the next president. It should be a woman. And it should be a woman because of how much toxic energy that Michael D has brought to the office currently. I want to see someone who isn't as filled with their own arrogance and is willing to actually be compassionate and understanding, and actually not care so much about their own image and about being shock jock and about cozying up to all kinds of dictators on the left. That kind of nonsense I want gone.
Okay. So
I want absolutely gone.
That's very clear. And of course, those characteristics, I would say, David, can come in all genders.
They can.
But I hear you. I hear you on almost having a sharp departure from what we have now. And again, we've had many. I mean, of course, Mary Robinson, Mary McAleese, two amazing representatives for the country who did a fantastic job on elevating the office of president, but also at the same time focusing on real issues. Mary McAleese, which we'll talk about in a moment as well, in the broader context of Northern Ireland, and building bridges as the cornerstone for her presidency, and using the office effectively to, mend fences, build relationships, and kind of spur positive energy into the country on a very complex issue, which led to many, many deaths over many, many years.
Bingo. And like, that's an example of someone using the office towards the common good, but in a way that isn't a clash on day-to-day politics and isn't actually stoking divisions on issues where people can see things differently.
Yeah.
Just to end this segment with maybe some, again, like, outlook to the future is important. And if I'm going to do the rant that I've had, I should be constructive about where things go next. I've written out a couple of areas that I think the next president could focus on and could kind of repair that relationship, and would be in line with day-to-day politics, right, and not clashing. The current president has done very little entrepreneurship. Okay, I think the next president could be hosting entrepreneurs up in the auras, promoting them in a very kind of general way, appointing an entrepreneur to the Council of State, because there isn't an entrepreneur there currently.
Great idea.
So yeah, there's some very diverse people on that council, and I think they do a fantastic job. But an extra voice there from a business background would be great. I think topics that we've discussed before on this podcast, Dale, things like loneliness, relationships, marriage, family, these kind of trends, issues of childlessness, and the birth rate. Those are issues where a lot of the solutions are actually a cultural change, not a policy change. So again, the presidency holding maybe a series of seminars and lectures on those, hosting speakers into the Ors could be a very good thing. Defence, I think, in a world where the threats to Ireland have actually only been elevated now since the Ukraine war, and they come in different forms. Cyber, for example, the presidency should be more active on their role as commander of the defence forces. I want to see the next president actually going out to where the defence forces are doing military exercises and actually being present and almost taking on a kind of on the ground leadership role in that, and that can still be in line with Ireland's neutrality. And so, look, I think if the president did even a few of those things, that could make for a very different presidency, and one that could actually be away from this kind of clash of day-to-day politics that we've had for until now.
I love the idea of making entrepreneurism centerfold of the presidency, because it's an area where Ireland has so much potential, I think, but possibly by our cultural risk aversion, and also other areas, I think, on the Irish psyche, we haven't exactly unleashed that potential. I think there's actually another Celtic tiger that could be unleashed there in a positive sense for the country going forward. And the Council of State is an interesting one because, I mean, like, the role of the Council of State fundamentally is to advise the president on the constitutionality of bills, and it's made up of, former senior office leaders and current senior office leaders of the state. Yes. But of course, the president has the right to appoint a number of people to it.
And just say that so there's 7 people there currently, and some of the backgrounds include disability, travellers, the Irish abroad. So there's a diverse range of people there.
I think my question more so is the role of the Council of State. Right now, it's quite, like, I love the diverse background that we have there, but it's really limited to the role of just advising the president on the constitutionality of bills. It'd be great to see how could we actually maybe change that in some way, and perhaps it could give broader advice or broader discussions on some of these cultural issues that we mentioned, David, because I just feel right now we aren't unleashing the potential of a really elevated body like that. Is kind of the point I'm trying to make here.
Yeah,
you know?
that's a good point. You could make the
scope is
count.
like the scope is just too limited, I think.
Yeah, so maybe all the council state members could be their own subcommittee that meet and are more of like they could produce reports. You could give them a research budget. They could be, studying different topics and giving opinions on it. So like in Germany, I think of the example of they have a kind of like it's kind of like a body of 5 or 6 economists, kind of like top leaders in the economics world, and they will produce reports advising the country on the main risks to the economy into the longer term. So they're trying to take longer term perspectives on things. You could make the Council of State a wider, recommending body on cultural and social change. That might be just problematic in that that could also be something that is a government initiative, not a presidency initiative.
Well, this is the thing.
So it's hard to straddle the whole day-to-day politics issue.
Well, I liked I liked your distinction though between like some of these issues being more cultural in nature and therefore probably falling under the purview of the president versus political, which of course is it's going to be the government of the day. I think that's actually a pretty good distinction.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then, keeping that distinction, then something like that. Yeah. That's the idea.
But one other thing, which I think just to shift gears a little bit here, one other area that I think the president may, depending if they do 2 terms and if we actually evolve here, but really is the piece around Northern Ireland. And former Taoiseach Leo Varadkar has this week said that a united Ireland should be an objective and not an aspiration. For whoever is in charge after the next general election, which is, I think, a pretty stark change in tone and ambition to objective from the former Taoiseach, where he believed that a united Ireland was likely in the coming decades. And he was speaking at the SDLP and Labour Party, the SDLP's New Ireland Commission, which has been established by its outgoing leader, Colm Eastwood. And, these comments are, I think pretty bold in the sense that I think it's a pretty active language being used in terms of where he sees Northern Ireland going in the context of the UK and Ireland. And of course, all of this is on the backdrop of strong change in demographics and polling support for a united Ireland with, I'm thinking back to a poll in last year by Ireland Thinks, which showed that 80% of people in the Republic supported reunification in principle. Now, I know that when you ask, when you further click on that and you ask for views on it might lead to higher taxes in order to assume Northern Ireland into the Republic, support for that dropped significantly then to just over half at 54%. But then in Northern Ireland, of course, there's a strong change in support as well. A poll by Ipsos last year showed that 38% of people supported reunification in Northern Ireland, while 50% want to remain. However, if you look at younger people, so people aged 18 to 34, it's as high as 48% express support for unification. So there's a general trend moving forward, and this on the backdrop of the context of change of government in Ireland, possibly in the general election, new president of Ireland next year, change of government in the UK, and Northern Ireland is very much back in focus about what does it look like and how are we going to trend towards going forward. My thoughts, David, and I'm curious to your reaction to this, is that I don't know if Northern Ireland will just be assumed into the South. I actually think it's a new country in many ways. I think it's a new structure. I think, what Leo Varadkar was mentioning was that, it might be a case of the Dáil meeting in Northern Ireland and Belfast, and having a split parliament almost. You might have guaranteed members, guaranteed British passport holders in the cabinet. But I actually think that's actually not far enough. I actually think it might be even a new country in totality, new structures, finding ways to guarantee representation. It could be provincial, actually. It might be a structure that we go down. But I did just want to call out one piece here, which is the economics behind it all, which I think is an important backdrop, which is, Northern Ireland is a challenged place economically. It gets an annual subvention of about £10 billion every year because that's its deficit in order to keep the lights on. It has a high dependency on public service employment, with about 23% of its workforce being employed in the public sector, compared to about 16%, which is the average across the UK. Unemployment is low, about 2.4%, but it has a high economic inactivity rate, which is actually about 27%. And its GDP per capita is also quite low. It's lower than the UK average. So it's a challenged place economically. One, you could argue, has been a victim of underinvestment and lack of focus. But the ultimate question is, if it was to come into Ireland and be our focus point, you'd have to pay for it. Now, I also think one thing that might happen is a replication of what happened when East Germany went into West. And I think this might be a case of, EU structural funds supporting an integration would be, I think, top priority for the EU to make it a success story. So I actually don't think the higher taxes argument would actually play out in reality. I think the EU would make this a real priority and focus point. I've thrown a lot at you there. What are your thoughts on Northern Ireland and its future?
Yeah, I think the mix of funding from EU, from London, and from Dublin could make this work. But also, a new structure for Northern Ireland could lead to the region's own ability to attract more foreign direct investment.
Sure.
So we already have in the north now a more competitive tax rate, trying to compete with Ireland's 15%, and that's already spurring some initial levels of FDI to come in. I mean, the pitch to the next wave of FDI as it comes into Ireland is, hey, look, you can put your FDI in Dublin, Cork, or Galway, where house prices are expensive and the transport system's overloaded, or go to Derry and Belfast, where you'll get the same corporate tax rate. You'll be in a favourable regime that will be, you'd hope, still within the European market and can still trade in the same way that the Republic can.
But by the way, that's a regime that's a bit different to, let's say, Hugo Chavez regime, right?
Oh yeah. I use that word for many different meanings to it. And you'd hope that people don't invest in those countries, right? Because the politics is very unstable.
That's right.
You'd hope that we're entering a world now where the politics in Northern Ireland is a little more stable. Now, we always have this on and off issue with the executive in the north. But if both sides of the divide in the north begin to realize, hey, look, running this region properly is in the best interests of all our people to be able to improve their economic and social lives and improve the various social metrics that lag the Republic and the UK.
Yeah.
That will be something that happens. But it is going to come down to these tense kind of cultural issues. It is going to come down to whether you recognize some of the Orange Order marches, whether you fly British flags in certain parts of the region and others you don't. It is going to come down to these very, very sensitive issues of identity. Irish language, for example, Scots Gaelic, all the Ulster Scots, all these different kind of language issues are going to come along again as well. And that is the risk of where things could be rolled backwards. Like, I think some sort of border poll, if it ever happened in the next 10, 20 years, would only spark a new wave of staunch unionism, which would actually then lead to more conflict. Like, the way people somehow see a border poll as being quote unquote progress, I think is incredibly misguided. I think potentially not even holding a border poll at all might be the best way forward, that you would end up with something that would be kind of like Brexit or be like Scottish independence, that would be so divisive and would be taking the whole region in an uncharted direction, that instead you should be looking at piecemeal changes that allow over the decades chip away at the current structure and actually begin to integrate with the South. So, for example, you could be integrating the health system or the pension system, and only doing that on an all-island basis.
And of course, there already is a great examples of sharing of resources between health in Northern Ireland and health in the Republic as well. There's already cross-border initiatives around education, around health. But I think you're right, David, on Brexit. I mean, look, we're still talking about Brexit. So far on, it totally divided the country, and it divided into it split the country right down the middle. I think, but of course, the constitutional framework that we're operating in, and the agreement between the Republic and the UK is that a majority in the South and the North have to agree to reunification, and that's why I just don't think, if you're to have a border poll now, people are going to ask, well, what's it going into, and what does the new structure look like? If the answer is just Northern Ireland into the South, I think it fails. And I actually think the South wouldn't vote for it. But I think if we use the next time over the next 10, 20 years to really think hard about what does a new Ireland look like, respecting all differences and backgrounds and recognizing the reality of where we've come to, but thinking about how a new structure can be inclusive for the country and for the island, I think that's the way to go forward. I don't think, you have Mary Lou McDonald talking about a border poll in the next 6 years. I think that's just very fanciful, and I don't think it's a way for progress or for continued peace on the island.
I agree.
Yeah. And then let's just turn to some job data to round us out. And this is just the job churn rate for quarter two of this year. Was down 1.5% on the same period in 2023. So new figures from the CSO shows that the job churn rate for the second quarter was down to 11.5% on the same time last year. So job churn, of course, is a measure of employee turnover, and it generally provides insight into the number of employees who have changed job and stayed in the same job as well. So a bit of a decrease, David, on this, and the trend has been going downward a little bit on this. If people there's been, I think, a little less change and activity happening in the area. The highest job churn rate recorded was for the admin and support sector, which was 26.6% in the second quarter, while the lowest rate of change was recorded in the information and communication sector. So, yeah, go ahead, David.
Yeah, the information and communication sector, of course, is IT.
Yeah.
It would include a huge chunk of computer programming and multinational jobs. And a low churn rate there is not what I would have said to expect maybe 2 years ago. So 2 years ago, there was a moment coming out of COVID where a lot of tech jobs looked like they were at risk. Employers had hired a lot of people during the work from home phase and then realized they actually didn't need as many staff as they did. The stocks fell for a lot of these big tech companies, and there was some waves of layoffs expected. But things seem to have really settled now in those sectors, and employment continues to be at quite high and elevated levels there, and Ireland benefits as well from being having the big multinational sector. This covers Q2. And we have had some unemployment data which has come out in the period since. We're within Q3 at the moment. But, the mix of data across Q2 and Q3 continues to show relatively low levels of unemployment. There has been a tick up, but that actually stabilized throughout the summer. So right now, so far, labour market in Ireland continues to be quite hot, quite a lot of jobs out there for people. That looks like it is tilting down gradually, that the availability of jobs is lowering, but we're still at a much higher level than we were pre-COVID. So it's still very much an employee's job market, not an employer's jobs market. And trends like, returning to the office are going to be harder for employers to do as long as the political power is in the hands of workers.
Yeah, and of course we've seen Amazon announce its hardline 5-day-a-week return to the office policy for all workers, and we're already seeing resistance on that with employees for Amazon organizing and complaining that that's not what they want to do. So I think that whole return to office battle is going to be an interesting one to watch. But of course, in the job data as well, David, the strong increase in hirings over the last quarter, up to just shy of 338,000. And a big a continued decrease in separations or firings, which is just shy of 250,000. So, and that's continuing a downward trend over the last few months from about 350,000 2 quarters ago.
Yeah, we've spoken on the show before how there's relative industrial peace in Ireland right now. There's large levels of strikes, and strikes can also emerge where some staff are being let go, that there's kind of unfair terms and that kind of stuff, and the other workers strike and all that. And look, if you don't have high firings, you're not going to get those kinds of conflicts. Where you may get conflicts now is on pay rises because of how hot the Irish economy is. I mean, the wage growth data, when I last checked it for Q2, was I think 5.5%. Year on year, which is super. And that's partly why you're seeing very high house prices growth now, which is now around 10%. And that's because people have high wages. And as long as there's good job availability, there's going to be wage pressure, you're going to have high house price growth too.
Okay. I think that's a good message to end on. That sounds positive. I mean, the increase in houses are, depending on where you're at, but more money and more wages, I think, is a nice one to end on. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. We'll do that.
On that note, good to see you again, David. Thanks for listening, everyone. If you did like this podcast, please please share, please subscribe. Again, we're available on all major podcast platforms. Also available on YouTube, where you can watch us and also subscribe to our channel there. We will speak to you next week and see you again as well. Thanks for listening and watching, and take care.